Welcome. This is a series of interviews conducted through the University of Texas Colloquium at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. It's a series of interviews with leaders in the area of evidence-based policy and research practice partnership. And our guest today will be Ruth Lopez-Turley. Dr. Turley is a professor of sociology at Rice University, who founded the National Network of Education Research Practice Partnerships, which supports and develops partnerships between research institutions and education agencies throughout the US. Earlier in her career, Dr. Turley founded the Houston Education Research Consortium, partnership with several unit districts near Rice University, starting with the Houston Independent School District, which is the 7th largest district in the US. The Houston Education Research Consortium connects researchers and decision makers with the goal of shrinking achievement gaps and improving student outcomes. I asked Dr. Turley to talk about her decision to found these partnerships and what their origins were in her, both in her personal experience and in her understanding of what school districts need to be more effective. She founded the Houston Education Research Consortium at a stage in her career when she was having substantial success as an independent researcher, and I'll ask about her decision to change directions like that. She'll also talk about when research partnerships can make a difference, as well as some of the challenges that partnerships face. Dr. Turley, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to do this.
I really appreciate your coming. I wonder if we can start with where your values come from originally. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Laredo, Texas, so not too far from here, and grew up on it's a border town. My family's from Mexico, and I was born and raised in a very bilingual, bicultural community that I really learned a lot from, and really there's some really wonderful things about growing up in such a community. But it was also a community that had a lot of challenges. In particular, there's a lot of poverty in that area, and I was among those families that were very poor and struggling with that poverty. But that also taught me a lot about just how challenging it is to lack resources, and unfortunately the lack of resources is often tied to a lack of opportunities as well. And that's the part that really had an impact on me, even at an early age, before I learned about all these things. But that's what compelled me to learn about these things and go into the sociology of education, because I wanted to do something about it. And I really thought that research could have an impact on changing these opportunities and making them more accessible, especially for those who are really disadvantaged. Unfortunately, I learned that that's not exactly how it works, that research can be really impactful, but the only way that that happens is if we make a very explicit effort to make it so. It's not something that I think, unfortunately, the way things are set up right now in academia, it's not something that just happens automatically. But we as researchers, if that's what we are wanting to do, then that's what we need. We need to make very explicit efforts to make sure that our research is informative, is timely, is relevant, and that we do the things that we need to do in order to connect that research directly to the potential users of that research.
Mm-hmm. So at the time you had this, maybe it was a sort of slowly dawning insight, or maybe it was an epiphany. You had recently received tenure at the University of Wisconsin, which at the time was the #1 sociology program in the country. So career-wise, according to your peers, you were doing great. But your own assessment of your impact was somewhat different.
Yeah, I mean, I had a really great time at Wisconsin. I learned a ton. I had really wonderful colleagues, really wonderful mentors, some of whom I still stay in touch with, and that I still consider mentors, actually. But yes, when I was promoted with tenure, I reflected on all of the research that I had produced up to that point, both the research that I had produced as an assistant professor, but also the research that I had produced as a graduate student. And all of it, was really, I thought it was all in sociology of education, and some of it really working with some school districts, in fact. But when I reflected on all that research, I realized that none of it had any impact that I could point to, that hadn't actually changed anything, and that was really deflating for me, and it was very concerning because of the fact that I got into this line of work because I wanted to make a difference, and I wanted to use research as a tool, for changing our structures and improving them in a manner that would allow for more opportunities for the most disadvantaged. And when I realized that none of the research that I had produced had actually done that, I know that those are lofty goals, but I couldn't point to any even smaller actionable change, any smaller change that would take us closer to that goal. So then I had to really think hard about what I was doing and why I was doing it. And honestly, in some ways, it felt like a midlife crisis, even though, I was too young to have a midlife crisis. But I felt like, I had to really question what I'm doing and how to make it more impactful. So when I got the opportunity to come to Rice, I took advantage of it, not only because I wanted to come back to Texas for both personal and professional reasons, but I needed that change of pace and fresh start. Wanted to get a chance to do research in a different way. And Rice was really open to that. I was very explicit before coming, saying I really want to do research in a different way, and they were like, we'll support you, we'll help you. And they did, actually. Rice administration in particular was very helpful when I first got here, in helping me set up those initial meetings, helping me set up those relationships initially with Houston ISD, and then later on we expanded to other Houston area school districts. But that kind of institutional support was really transformative.
Mm-hmm. So you moved to Rice. Within a year, you were starting a partnership with the Houston Independent School District. And one concern that researchers often have is that maybe districts are going to be distrustful. Maybe just districts don't want the insights that research can provide and don't want to make the changes. How do you set things up so that it's a more productive conversation?
That's a really great point, because I learned about that as well. In fact, I remember some years ago when I was at a conference. I believe it was the Council for Great City Schools. It was a conference that is typically attended by school district leaders, especially those that are involved in research and those kinds of things. So I attended this conference. I was a guest of one of my district partners, who at the time was an assistant superintendent at HISD. And I remember having a conversation with her and several others. These are leaders from districts all over the country. And I asked them how they determined whether to use research, like which research did they use and how did they make that decision. And at the time, I was pretty surprised to hear them say things like, it's based on whether we trust the authors. And I thought, whoa, because how can for a lot of research that we read, we don't even know the authors personally, right? And so how can we trust them? But of course, we still...
The kind of trust they were talking about, was it I trust that this author uses good methods and so on, like another researcher would say, or was it a different kind of trust?
It was the kind of trust where they're saying, like, we need to know that they understand us, that they understand our students, that they know our context. And I I was intrigued by that. Like, so this is about, it's not what I expected. Like, it's not necessarily the prestige of the journal or the prestige of the institution that the authors are at or anything like that. But they're like, we need to know that they understand us and they understand our students and they know our context. So that was really informative to me, and I think that's the reason why, to answer your question about, how is it that these districts can work with you in this way? And I think what has really helped is that it's a local partnership. We know each other on a, both personal and professional level. We interact. Of course, these days we don't interact in person as much anymore, but we did for a long time, and now it's all Zoom meetings. But the idea is that we are in a partnership that's designed to be long-term, and now this partnership has been in existence for almost 10 years, because it's not a project-based partnership, because we know that a lot of researchers do work with school districts, but often it's a project-based kind of collaboration that once that project is complete, they go their separate ways. But this is really not that. It's we like to say we're not dating, we're married. Like, this is a long-term commitment that we think is what is necessary in order to solve long-standing problems. And so that's the goal, and that's the commitment that we've made. And it is a very, developing and maintaining these kinds of relationships is very time consuming. But we have done a lot of things to make it as easy as possible to be able to have these kinds of relationships. And for example, we have a liaison that works at school district headquarters, but is paid by us. And sometimes she spends like once a week. Well, back when we worked in person, would spend one day a week with us on campus at Rice, the other 4 days at the district's headquarters. And so things like that are really, really important in making sure that we have really good communication, that we're constantly aware of what the other needs and what's coming down the pipeline, all of those kinds of things, so that there are no surprises. And all of this we learned through hard lessons, frankly, because we made a lot of mistakes early on. And I don't want to make it sound like those are all in the past. I'm sure we're still making some today that I may not even be aware of, but we made some big mistakes in early on in the partnership that were really unfortunate, but at the same time were really good, because that's how we learned these important lessons.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the way a lot of research works, but maybe the kind of research that you were doing before, is the researcher comes to the district and the researcher says, I want to understand X, and I need your data to do that, and I think it will be valuable to you. And the district may or may not provide the data, and the researcher goes off and does their thing and comes back 6 months later with a report that's sometimes really written with their colleagues in mind, and says, here you go. But when you're talking about a different process, you must have had meetings initially to even come to a shared understanding of what the district's challenges were and what kinds of solutions you should be working towards.
Right. It is a big temptation for researchers to, of course, because we're working in our own system with our own goals that have to do often, primarily with publications. The goal is to publish. And sometimes that goal aligns with the goal with the research that our district partners may be interested in. But obviously a publication is not their primary goal. Their primary goal is to solve problems that will help their students do better. And while that is also a goal of the researchers, unfortunately, the publication goal often supersedes that goal, whether we want to admit it or not. And districts, I've heard them use language such as, we often have research done to us.
Yes.
rather than for us and or with us. But that to us suggests that they see it as like, yeah, the researchers often just come in, collect their data and get out. And even if they see a report afterwards, it's not really designed for them. So yeah, in this partnership, and we're still developing this process to try to improve it. But it's a process that involves a lot of conversations before the start of any research project to make sure that this is actually, whatever we're about to undertake is actually going to work toward, goals that are mutually beneficial, goals that are trying to put the students at the top of that hierarchy. We know that there are a lot of interests, and researchers have different interests than districts, but ultimately the highest priority should be the interests of the students. And that is often a tough thing for various stakeholders to hang on to. They might say that that's the goal, but it's very easy to lose sight of that during the course of any research project. So we really aim to make sure that we put the students as a top priority. And then we talk about, okay, what are the goals? What exactly are we trying to do through this research? And then we do the research accordingly.
Yeah.
The other thing is that during the course of the research project, we really work hard to make sure that we're, again, having that good communication, clear communication throughout the project, so that by the time a project is finished, there are no surprises. The district has been hearing preliminary results all along the way. They know what's coming. They can respond to it. And frankly, by the time a report is written, it's old news, right? They've already seen this, and we share all our reports with them. They actually review we have an internal review process and an external review process, and they're part of that external review process. So that by the time a report is released to the public, like, they really have been a huge part of the process all along the way.
It's interesting. Not only do researchers and institutions sometimes have different incentives, but their education can be kind of an acrimonious area. I teach this class in debates in education policy. And there are different constituencies and reform movements, and people often view researchers with certain ideologies often view the district as actually the problem. And that's obviously, when a researcher comes in with that attitude, that's obviously not going to be a fruitful relationship.
No.
So can you talk about maybe one of the...
that a mile away.
So can you talk about a little bit about your shared understanding with Houston ISD about what some of the district's challenges are, and talk about a particular project where you feel you were able to define a research question that was relevant to them, where they actually changed something as a result of the study?
Sure, yes. There's several really recent examples, actually, but lots of great things happening right now. But I wanted to start off by saying a little bit about that challenge that you mentioned, that sometimes we, not just researchers, of course, the general public does this as well, that we see schools or school districts as the problem, or at least a part of the problem. And while, of course, I mean, our district partners will be the first to admit they're absolutely not perfect, and that they have many, many constraints in what they're trying to do. What we as researchers aim to understand the fact that they have many constraints placed upon them, and that they're trying to do their best with very limited resources and very limited information. So that's the part we're trying to help with. That we're trying to provide them with better information, and hopefully use that information to help them get more resources as well. And so one example that I found very exciting a couple of years ago had to do with full day pre-K. So HISD started doing full day pre-K some years ago, even though the state did not require full day pre-K. But they went ahead and made the investment in full day pre-K because they felt that it was that important. But they asked us to monitor its impact. Because they're like, we're making, it's expensive, right? We're making this huge investment, even though the state doesn't require this, but we want to make sure that it's actually a worthwhile investment. And so we did some analyses on the impact of full day pre-K, particularly on school readiness as measured by at the start of kindergarten. And in education research, it's pretty unusual to find anything that has like a huge impact, right?
But early childhood is an area where it can happen.
We found a significant, it basically doubled the chances of the kids being school ready in kindergarten. And the crazy thing is that because of data limitation, we just knew whether they had HISD full day pre-K. The comparison group, they could have had some other pre-K. We didn't know what else they did. It wasn't just full day pre-K versus nothing. It was full day pre-K versus we don't know. Mm-hmm. And even then, we found this huge impact. And so we were like, this is an underestimate. Yeah. We know this is an underestimate. And even then, it's basically doubling the chances of being school ready. So we were amazed, and we did all kinds of sensitivity analyses because we wanted to make sure like this is a real thing, and all of the analyses pointed to the same conclusion. When we shared this with the superintendent at the time was Richard Carranza, and he not only did they use that obviously for their own purposes, which by the way, what they did is they expanded full day pre-K in the district. And then we did follow-up analyses to help to inform how to do that in a strategic manner. Yeah. But they also took that to Austin. So the superintendent shared these findings with our state legislators, and nothing happened, but and I got a chance to testify a few times, and others on my team as well. But 2 years later, HB 3 was passed, and it was and they that, yes, and I know that a lot of people were involved in that effort. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, we did it. No, that's absolutely not the case. But our research was used. And we're just thrilled. We're thrilled because actually the goal was to have our research used at the local level. That's all we were focusing on. But then the superintendent took it to the state level, and we were just thrilled that it was used both at the local level and at the state level. And like I said, a lot of other research studies followed in terms of expanding access to full day pre-K.
So this is a dream scenario, right? Where it's something the district's already doing. You do an evaluation of it, it's working beautifully. You tell them they should expand it, which they want to do anyway. So in a sense, this is a great situation that where everybody comes away with good feelings. As you say, it's a little unusual in education research to find large positive effects. The norm is that the effects you find, if there are any at all, are fairly minimal. Mm-hmm. You must have run in your 10 years of working with Houston ISD and other school districts, you must have run into scenarios like that. How does that conversation go? Yeah,
absolutely. That's an unusual scenario just because you asked for an example of like the research results being used. Sure. So I'll give you it's a negative example in the sense that the results were negative, mm-hmm. but the results were still used. That's the mm-hmm. thing. Even if the results are negative, they're still important, still useful. But yeah, we some years ago, the district asked us to do an evaluation of a reading program. And the district invested a lot of money in this reading program. We did a series of evaluations for over a couple of years, and found that it was not having much of an impact. In fact, there was a little bit of evidence that suggested that it might even have had a negative impact, which is even worse, right? That's the last thing a district wants to hear. but they were very receptive to that feedback, even though it was disappointing feedback, because I think, we could have framed it as, look, the district is wasting all this money on a program that doesn't work. But we
Alert the
didn't.
press, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's unfortunately that's how people like to share news, right?
Right.
And that, while it's true, technically speaking, that's not really fair, right? So the way we framed it was like, kudos to the district for identifying this problem with struggling readers, B, investing a lot of resources into trying to address that problem, 3, collaborating with researchers to monitor its impact, and 4, when they learned that it wasn't having the desired impact, they made changes, right? And it's not like those changes fixed. I mean, the problem of struggling readers is a huge issue nationwide that, we're all still working on this. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, then they fixed it and everything was fine. No, honestly, they're still working on it.
Yeah.
But we all realize, and we have to realize as researchers especially, we're not going to solve these huge problems with a single research study.
Yeah.
And so we need some humility in this process, but at the same time, we need to acknowledge that we're there as partners to help districts in these efforts. But when these efforts are not working, we shouldn't play the blame game and make it seem like, oh, look at that, they're just doing a terrible job, and this is it is a terrible situation, but we can't just, it's not that simple. And especially as a sociologist, like, we know that these problems have to do with major systems, and it's not as simple as, oh, this one person or this one group of people, it's their fault.
And there's an understanding in the district that what they were doing previously was not as effective as they would have liked, and change is necessary, right, as a result of your study. So that's really important, because there's so much inertia in many institutions, and if they don't get any feedback on what's working and what's not, the inertia continues.
In fact, they were really receptive in this, because we did 2 years worth of studies for this particular reading program. In the first year, because we used a regression discontinuity design. They actually made some adjustments, some tweaks in the program, so that in the following year we could use the RDD methodology for a slightly different range of reading scores.
So they're actually starting to design their programs with evaluation in mind, which is, of course,
yes, they made. Yeah. I was actually very impressed that they made that adjustment in order to accommodate the research design. And unfortunately, it was still bad news. So then they're like, okay, this is clearly not working. But then we felt more confident in that conclusion. Yeah.
That's fabulous. Let me ask you an institutional question here. So, if you're working with a small rural or suburban district, limited budget and so on, I could see where services like yours would be really needed. But Houston, while its per pupil spending is in the neighborhood of $10,000, it's a total of a $2 billion budget. So they, in theory, could find room in that budget to have a team like yours in-house. They could have their own analysts, they could have their own data warehouse. What is the advantage?
Yeah, no, to answer your question, which is about, they have this enormous budget, shouldn't they be able to afford to do their own, and they have their own research and accountability department. We work closely with them, but there are several advantages. Well, there's an issue, and then there's an advantage. The issue is that even then, a lot of large school districts don't have sufficient research capacity. They collect a lot of data. Often it's data that they're required to collect by the state, but they have to focus a lot of their energy on the accountability side of things. And so that even though NHISD does, their research department does their own in-house research, aside from all the accountability stuff, but the accountability side of things, I think, takes up a lot of their energy, and they have limited research capacity. But in that sense, it's helpful to have a research institution where that's our primary activity, that can then provide some of that research capacity to help the local community. But there's also an advantage to that. Like, even if, hypothetically speaking, the district could invest a lot of resources in their own in-house research department, the fact is that often the broader community is skeptical. Is skeptical of any research that they produce in-house. It would be similar to, you know, the potential conflict of interest that we as researchers, even academic researchers, worry about, or they should worry about, when a project or when a program or intervention is implemented by the same people that are evaluating it, right? That's not an ideal situation. You don't want the same people, or the same people that designed the program, to evaluate it, because we think, well, they might be biased. So it's similar to that. Like, when a school district is evaluating their own programs in-house, the broader public is sometimes skeptical of that. Whether it's warranted or not is it's another issue, but they're skeptical of that. And so it can be really helpful for the district to be able to say, no, but we had an external group of researchers at Rice University do these analyses. And that can give them even a political buffer that can be really helpful, so that we try to just focus on what is helping the students, as opposed to all the politics that can get tangled up.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy. If you think about cereal companies, right, printing their own internal research showing that Special K can help you lose weight and as part of a balanced breakfast and so on, it doesn't have as much credibility as a nutrition study coming out of a major university.
Exactly.
So in addition to simply the capacity. So we're at the half-hour mark. I want to ask you one last question before we go, which is, it's not just Houston ISD anymore. You're working with 11 school districts, and you formed this umbrella organization, the National Network of Education Research Partnerships. Can you talk about how that expansion took place, and whether it's been, how manageable it's been for you, how you've managed to scale up?
Yeah, it was quite the expansion, because our research team basically doubled in size in like a year, in less than a year. So it was a lot to manage. But I have a great research team, so that was really helpful, and a great admin team that really was important in this expansion. But I would say, so the really important thing about the expansion is that a lot of the issues that we're working on are not ultimately district specific.
Yeah.
You think about it, anything, teachers or whatever, the teacher job market is not district specific. It's regional. And students move around a lot, both within districts and between neighboring districts. So a lot of these issues that we were coming up against, we realized that they're regional issues. They're not district issues per se. So it was really important to expand to, so all these 11 school districts, they're all neighboring districts. They share borders with one another. And
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you work with the charter operators in Houston as well?
Nope, okay. Not at this point. That possibility has come up, but we're not.
They're an important growing part of the ecosystem there. But
they are.
Yeah. Okay.
They are. But no, we have two branches of research within HERC. One is district specific, but the other is regional. And for our regional research agenda, we work with all of the districts simultaneously. They actually meet together it used to be in person. I keep wanting to say in person, and I have to qualify it. But they actually meet twice a year at all of the districts together to talk about the research agenda that they want for the region. So that's also really, really exciting to me, because I think that now we can really start to think about systemic changes.
Mm-hmm. You used the abbreviation HERC a minute ago. It's the Houston Education Research Consortium, where Houston here refers now to the Houston metro area, not just Houston Independent School District.
That's right.
Yeah, and then the other organization that you've founded is the National Network of Education Research Partnerships. How did that come about? So
I helped to found this national network precisely because I needed the help. I was trying to figure out things that were quite challenging. And so I kept reaching out to partners or folks that were in similar partnerships in other cities, primarily Chicago, New York City, San Francisco. I had colleagues in all of those locations that were working in similar partnerships, and we really leaned on each other as we were trying to figure out how to do this work, because frankly, it's a relatively new field or subfield. So we would try to meet at basically piggyback off of other conferences when we met, and finally we realized we need to start our own conference, our own national conference. So HERC hosted for a couple of years. We hosted a national conference here at Rice, and then we raised enough money to officially launch this national network in 2016 and hired a national director, Paula Arcetrigati, who's still the director and doing a fantastic job. Yeah. So we have an annual forum, and in fact, so this year we had to have an annual forum online for the first time, like so many other conferences. But we had, I don't know, it was something like 600 registrants. I mean, it was pretty amazing. Yeah. So this is an opportunity for, so there are 600 folks from different education research partnerships or who are thinking about starting one. Yeah, usually we don't have that many people attend because it's in person and it costs money. But because it was in an online format, we had a lot more people attending. And the great thing is that these are just both district folks as well as folks at research institutions. And most of the partnerships are between a research institution and a local education agency, like a school district, but there are some that are partnering with state education agencies as well. So clearly there's been tremendous growth, but there's much more growth potential. There are something like over 10,000 school districts in the United States. That's right. But it is harder. You mentioned the rural and smaller school districts earlier. It is harder for them to find a local research partner, and that's something that I've thought about as well, and I know that the National Network is thinking about as well. We're trying to figure out, if there are ways that we can support smaller and rural school districts and not only the large urban districts. Yeah, fabulous. Well, I want to thank you for taking a half hour out of your Friday morning to talk to us, and I know that the LBJ community and the larger YouTube community will be really interested in what you have to say. Thanks so much for your time. Thank you for the invitation. It's been great. Thank you.